It tends to be seen as a replacement to their own human output. Lots of potential translation buyers also see it as an opportunity to get rid of human intervention and intellect towards something that is significantly less expensive and easier to manage. What is up? Today I want to talk about something that's very important, which is the level of disruption that artificial intelligence will bring to the translation industry and potentially even ripple out to other industries, not from a technical perspective, but from a broader macroeconomic perspective. So when most translators tend to approach this technology, they tend to see it as a threat. It tends to be seen as a replacement to their own human output. Lots of potential translation buyers also see it as an opportunity to get rid of human intervention and intellect towards something that is significantly less expensive and easier to manage. And while all of that is true to some extent, there are other important truths to be considered from an economic perspective. So first, let's talk about the bigger, broader background issue. So from a broader, bigger background issue, when we talk about technological revolutions, say, for instance, the Industrial Revolution, which was a technological revolution, that tended to get very complex work, say, for instance, the work of a blacksmith. And when you take the work of a blacksmith, that's full of little micro decisions here and there and creativity and improvisation. When that gets laid out into an assembly line, all of that improvisation gets lost. The tasks get deconstructed into very simple, predictable, manageable tasks, which from the blacksmith's perspective can be very degrading, dehumanizing, and can mean that that art is no longer there. And like I said, that is a very valid perspective. Now, when you take it from a broader macroeconomic perspective in the blacksmith's case, that means a lot more people are probably going to be able to afford their work. So previously their work was only catering to a very small amount of the population who could afford it. Now that work is available to a much broader amount of society. So when you think about the effects that happen, and let's transport that blacksmith example back into today's times with translations. So let's say a given translation would cost $500 today. Now, let's say that through augmented artificial intelligence translation, that same $500 could be reduced, let's say, to $100. And let's put aside, for instance, the human perspective for just a second. So by diminishing from $500 to $100, and by it taking, let's say, for instance, 2 hours as opposed to 2 days, all of a sudden, that same translation is accessible to a whole range of buyers who were previously not being able to access it previously. So when we talk about the democratization of cost, which means basically having a given good or service be available to a greater amount of the population, and you think about that in terms of economic development, the economic development that comes from that could be very big. So let's say, for instance, today, it's a very small percentage of companies that choose to go down the path of internationalization. Why? Because it's very expensive. Well, when you make the process of internationalization of a product or a good or service more affordable, that means that a whole range of companies, maybe tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of companies who before would consider that to be prohibitively expensive, now consider that within their range. So let's, again, think about this task that used to cost $500 and is now costing $50 or $100. Let's suppose $100 for the sake of this argument. So now that that task is costing only $100, maybe instead of having only one company translate at $500, maybe now you're going to have 20 companies translate at $100. So think about it. Instead of having $500 being spent towards translation, in this same scenario, now you have $2,000 spent towards translation. Why? Because you're selling to a much bigger pool. And how will you get from 500 to 100 and still maintain livelihood? Well, that's the leap that technology allows us to take. So in essence, for instance, and maybe the tech isn't there right now, but let's say, for instance, I could produce 4 times faster through augmented translation. That would mean that it would be entirely feasible for me to maintain at least my standard of income by producing a lot more, even if I were, for instance, paid proportionally less for the word count. Let's say, as an example, my per hour rate would ultimately be the same because my productivity would be so much higher. So it's this constant game of affordability versus market reach, right? So if you make something affordable, that means the market reach is a lot bigger. And if you make things more expensive, that means the market reach is a lot smaller. So when you think about it from a microcosm perspective, at least for me, for instance, if I were to be a translator, I would want prices to be as high as I could. That means I make more money. But the challenge with that is that I create a bottleneck for my own growth and professional possibilities, because as I drive prices higher, that means that I also drive demand lower. As I drive prices lower, that means I drive demand higher. And then you have all of the subsequent cycles that derive from this affordability. So if you have more companies, for instance, internationalizing, and they realize the benefit of localization, maybe they're also going to realize the benefit of having a really good copywriter in Dutch or Korean or Japanese or Brazilian Portuguese or Spanish, because they're going to notice that, okay, now I've tapped into this market. I realize that there is opportunity. I've realized that it is economically attainable. Now I want to get better. I want to optimize this game, which means I'm willing to invest more. I'm willing to now pay additional dollars for someone who's going to make that extra layer of difference. And it's really easy to think about it from, let's say, some items over the past 20 years, for instance, TVs, toys, computer software, cell phone services, clothing, household services, and new cars have overall become more affordable in the past 20 years. And it's fairly easy to see that. I mean, and you could argue, let's say, whether a TV could be beneficial or not for a household, but it's fairly easy to see that these things can drive a greater standard of living, can drive more access to information, can drive more ease of transportation. And again, I'm not trying to get into a huge debate over cars are good or bad, over whether household furnishing is good or bad. Fact is that most people, to some degree, need it, whether they need it too much or too little, whether they have too much or too little of it. The fact is that they do increase standard of living. Now, on the contrary, certain vital services like hospital services, like college tuition fees, college textbooks, medical care services, childcare and nursery school services, have food and beverages and housing have all become incredibly more expensive over the past 20 years, proportional to consumer buyer power. And it's fairly easy to say how this proportional expensifying of these accounts, they really drive negative factors into the economy, because these are things that everybody needs. And if housing was more affordable, if hospital services were more affordable, if college tuition fees were more affordable, this could probably drive a lot more democratization towards opportunity, towards access, and that could really create a very positive economic cycle moving forward. So the key point that I'm trying to make here is that driving prices down doesn't mean that people will necessarily earn less if those prices are being driven down by technological opportunity and not just, let's say, for instance, by price cannibalization. So there's very different factors that will drive costs down. If costs are being driven down by efficiencies that are being introduced into technology, into a given service good or into a service or good based on a given technology, that could be something potentially very virtuous. And again, let's go back to the example of translating, right? If translation becomes more of a common thing, if everybody does that, that means that there will be a lot more competition for what goodness means. And if there's more competition for what goodness means, that probably means that the people who really excel at the art are going to be able to charge significantly more, because it's going to be an item that is in so much greater visibility and demand from an overarching perspective. So I understand the paradox of it all, and I understand that it doesn't seem this way from the translator-seller perspective. The seller wants higher prices, but ultimately that could be a little bit of a short-sighted perspective. In the long run, there is no way that driving prices higher will ultimately lead to greater overall economic activity and income generation. So these are my thoughts for today. I realize they're a little bit controversial. If you have any thoughts, please feel free to like, comment, disagree. Really thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe if you like this content.